Good afternoon, scholars. I hope you all are doing well and in preparation for a safe and enjoyable spring break. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to cover chapter 9 today. So I'll share my screen here shortly, but just wanted to go over a few things just concerning the rest of the semester. So just be mindful of the proposal, part 1 of the proposal that was due this past Sunday. If you haven't gotten that in, again, just be mindful that you get a freebie, 2 freebies for late work. But after those 2 freebies are used up, then the late penalty will be assessed. So that's five points per day that an assignment is late. Okay. The quality of your work will be assessed, and especially with the larger project. So the proposal is going to be a really, really big project for you. 50 points for part 1 of the introduction and the literature review, 50 points for the method section, and then there's 100 points total for the entire proposal itself. So be mindful of that. Again, a big chunk of your grade, 200 points or 20%. Also, we are not going to do peer review. I thought about it, and I think it'll just be easier for me to give you the feedback, and then you make the necessary changes that you see fit. I will be assessing the feedback that I do provide to you, and then when you submit your final proposal, if some of my suggestions you don't take, there's some suggestions that you might not take, but those that are more pivotal, I will identify those ones that are really, really essential that you do change. And so I'll be looking to assess those as you again as you submit, your final proposal. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. This will be chapter 9. We're talking about conducting experiments. You do have a homework that is due on Sunday, the 12th. So just be mindful. This will be covered in that quiz or that homework there. So just stay on top of everything. You all are doing a phenomenal job. I've already posted midterm grades. All of you are doing extremely well. A lot of B's, a lot of A's. So just keep up the great work. Keep coming to class. Attendance is half the battle. And just continue to work hard. I'm really proud of you all. I'm really, really proud when I was looking at the midterm grades. So just keep the momentum and stay encouraged as you all, enter into the next phase of the semester. All right, let me share my screen, and we'll get in and out of here. Okay. All right. So again, we are talking about chapter 9. This is conducting experiments. And again, this will be covered on the quiz that you have on Sunday. Okay, that'll be due on Sunday. Here are some of the objectives. So we're going to talk about, the distinction between straightforward and stage manipulations. There'll be a short video kind of giving you an example of how someone would stage a manipulation of the independent variables. We're also going to talk about 3 types of independent variables and how they're measured. And, those are really, really important as we talk about collecting data and what type of data we're going to collect. Sensitivity of the dependent variable. So we'll talk about, we want to be able to see changes in the dependent variable, right? So if we are looking at a particular supplement, maybe it's a caffeine pill, and we're wanting to assess energy level or some other variable, we want to be able to see that there is a difference in energy level based on the independent variable that's manipulated, okay? And then we'll cover all the rest of these, and we'll go through them in extreme detail, okay? All right, so selecting research participants. So we are at a stage now where your next part of your proposal is going to be, getting your method section together, right? And so the biggest part of getting your methods, the first thing is to determine who your participants are. In one of your group projects, I was asking you to create a survey and survey questionnaire and I was looking at your sampling frame. And many of you, for your groups, the sampling frame was very, very broad. But for your method section, when you're identifying who your sampling frame is, who your participants are, who you're wanting to do your research on, that population, it needs to be extremely specific. So many of you would say, one of the groups said that they were going to survey fourth graders, right? But fourth graders is extremely a huge population of students, right? So what are the distinctions between what fourth graders are you surveying, right? Are these students in public schools? Are they in private schools? Are they, what ethnicity are they, right? Are they male, female? Do they attend Title I schools versus non-Title I schools? Do they attend school in the Northeast or the Southwest? Right. So all of those types of descriptives are really, really important when we start about describing our participants. Okay. And so when we are drawing a sample, because if we recall, in research, especially when we're doing research on behaviors, it's almost impossible for us to assess an entire population. So we're not going to be able to do an experiment for the entire population. So what we have to do is we have to draw a sample. We draw a sample from that population, and we use two techniques, one of two techniques. You can either do probability sampling, which is kind of that gold standard. We talk about random sampling, those variations that we talked about in last chapter, right? So we have stratified, we have cluster sampling. All of those are considered random sampling variations. And then you have non-probability sampling, where those could be convenience sampling, where I want to survey students outside of Foster, right? So I set a table out, I have a survey instrument, and I am getting anybody that walks by. And it's really convenient because whoever walks by and is willing to take the survey is then able to take the survey, right? So that's really convenient. And so that's non-probability sampling. Not everyone has an equal chance of being selected. As with random sampling variations, everyone has an equal chance of being selected to participate in the research project or study, okay? So again, when we know our research participants, okay, again, it's important to accurately describe the population. We have to be able to describe the population, because when you don't know your population, when you don't know the specifics of your population, your data can be skewed or misinterpreted or misread, right? So if I'm looking at, how reading or literacy scores in fourth graders, right? If I just take a sample of fourth graders from a private school, right, that's going to be very misleading, because many times individuals who are in private schools come from higher income backgrounds, and usually have higher literacy rates than those in lower income rates, right? So we want a really, really representative sample. So we have to include those in private school and those in public school to assess literacy at a more natural way, okay? Again, in research, it says that it's more interested in testing hypotheses about behavior. The participants may be found more easily using non-probability sampling, right? So if we're wanting to describe the population, right, generalize our results to the population, we want to use probability sampling. And if we want to just describe behavior, right, then we could use maybe a convenience sample, right? And so we want to be able to describe either the population by generalizing, or try to describe or explain behavior by using non-probability sampling. Increasing your sample size will always increase the likelihood that you're going to get something that's really, really significant. And so it's really important that especially when you're sending out a survey, that you create an instrument that is going to be appealing and that many people will take, right? So you want your response rate to be extremely high, so that, again, you're able to get and increase the likelihood that you're going to get very, very robust results, okay? So here's the first stage, right? So when we develop our research experiment or research project, we have to then begin to think about how we're going to manipulate the independent variable. So how are we going to do that, right? So you either have a control group or an experimental group, right? So if we go back to one of the examples we used with the plants, right? Both of the plants had very similar, if not the same, pot size, same height of the plant, same soil, same watering, all of that, all of those things were the same. We controlled for those variables. And the only difference was whether you set it in the light or set it in a dark place, right? And so you have a plant that did get light and a plant that didn't, right? So we set that up. And we want to make sure that we are manipulating those variables in a way that we see a difference. We see a difference. One of the first things that we do if we're working with participants and not, with inanimate objects is we have to supply participants with information necessary so that they consent, right? So you're going to do a consent form for your participants. You give them the consent form, and then you have to make a setting, right, that is really, really plausible for participants. So they have to be able to buy into your research project, right? They have to feel like they're safe. They have to feel like it's a professionally done. You have to be organized. And so what gets a lot of researchers in trouble is that they don't prepare. And when you don't prepare, then your research results aren't always as robust, and you usually won't get something that's really significant and profound, right? So if you're really, really, if you're extremely organized and you make the research project really, really plausible and organized, and you're really, you just you're really professional, then again, your participants will be a lot likely to better participate. Okay, it says exactly how the variable is manipulated depends on the variable and the cost, practicality, and the ethics of the procedure, right? So depending on how you manipulate the variable depends on a few things. If I'm in a hospital and I'm testing out a cancer drug, right? That could be very, very, you have to think about the ethical considerations, right? Because if both of my participants has cancer, right? If they both have cancer, then I want to make sure that even if I don't originally give one of the participants the drug, right? I'm looking at a control versus an experimental group. I eventually need to give that person who was in the control group the actual drug so that it does in fact help them, right? So if I want to see a reduction in maybe a tumor size, then again I give particular message to one in the experimental group, and then I give it to the one in the control group maybe after the experiment. Because you want to be ethical and you want to make sure that everyone is benefiting from the research. Okay. So there are two types of manipulation, right? So when we separate our participants into groups, there are two types of manipulations. There's a straightforward manipulation, right? And then there is also a stage manipulation. The first straightforward manipulation, you're gonna use a stimuli to manipulate an independent variable. So let's go back to the plant example, right? So with the plant example, again, the plants were exactly the same in the same pot, in the same soil. They were watered the same amount. They had everything the same. Everything was controlled for. The only difference, and this is a straightforward manipulation, the only difference is that one of the plants received light and the other plant did not, right? That is very, very straightforward. Either you receive light or you don't. Another straightforward manipulation. I give one drug to the treatment group. I don't give a drug to the control group, right? Very, very straightforward manipulation. Again, I'm giving one to one group and not giving it to the other. Extremely straightforward. The stage manipulation, right? We want to create what we call a psychological state in participants or stimulate a real world situation, right? So when we do that, we may oftentimes have to use what we call a confederate. And a confederate is an actor, right? AKA actor. And they appear to be a part of the study, but they appear to be participants in the study, but they are part of the research team, right? They're being used as a way to create this setting where it looks like it's more real world. And that happens again when we're talking about behaviors and how people behave, right? You want to create a different psychological state, right? They want the participants to understand or feel like they're in a real situation so that their behaviors aren't affected by it seeming like it's artificial, right? Because when you have an artificial setting, you take a person to a lab, they're probably going to behave a little differently than as if they were in a real world out in the natural setting of their environments. Okay, one example of a stage manipulation is the classic Ash conformity experiment. We'll talk about that here shortly. But here is a straightforward. Here's an example of a straightforward manipulation, right? Exposure to a specific stimulus or non-exposure to a stimulus. So here was a study that was done, and the researchers were looking at exposure to a happy film versus a sad film and how that affected a participant's optimism about the future, right? So the results found that if the participants looked at a happy film, I love Coming to America. I also love Titanic, but they are very, very distinct, very, very separate films, right? One of them is very, very happy and has a lot of comedic value, and the Titanic gets pretty gloom and sad towards the end, right? So those who watched happy film, more joyous film, had more. They affected their optimism in a positive way, so they increased their optimism. Individuals who watched a sad movie, their optimism was reduced. And so again, just exposing one group to the happy film and then exposing another group to the sad film, we saw very, very differences in optimism. And then we also have to think about, we talked about in a previous class, those extraneous variables. So what other variables might impact someone's optimism, right? So just because we give a group of students an opportunity to watch a sad film and another to watch the happy film, there are other variables that might influence someone's optimism about the future. And so we have to control for those things. One thing that we might do, like we talked about in the previous class, is we might do a repeated measures design where we show one movie to the same group. We show both movies to the same group, but at different times. So we get a group of 50 students. We show them the happy movie. They fill out an optimism survey. Okay. Then we wait about 2 weeks. Then we bring them back and we show them a sad movie like the Titanic. And then we give them the questionnaire about optimism. We see, are there any differences in optimism? That might be a better way to conduct this experiment. Okay. So here's a stage manipulation. Okay. So Solomon Asch, he experimented with investigating how social pressure and the environment around us help or hinder us from conforming to certain behaviors, right? So what they did was they devised an experiment, and very, very classic experiment in social psychology. What they did was they had individuals study this target line, and then they asked them to compare this target line and determine which line it matched in the on the right hand side, either A, B, or C. So what they did was they had Confederates, they had actors participating in this study, and so the actual participant had no clue. He thought everyone was a participant, and when they brought these individuals in, they were testing them on vision, right? So they held out the target line a little further out at the distance, and they had the other answers on the right hand side so they could compare. And if the participant gave an incorrect answer during this experiment, it would only be that they were pressured, right? Because obviously, if I'm by myself, and almost 99% of the time when they did this test with individuals by themselves, they got the answer right 99% of the time. It was when they put the individual in the group, and the group participants, the Confederates, they already knew before going in that they were going to get the answers wrong, right? So they would ask everybody in the group, right? Which target line, which line matches the target line, right? And they would say A, and everybody in the group would say A. And then they would get to the end of the line, they would ask the actual participant, and they would think about it. And they were like, everybody else said A, so I'll go ahead and say A, right? So results showed that with this experiment, that again, people do conform. They do conform, especially when the group is a pretty good size, right? So over the course of time, they did several trials, and about 45% at least 35% of the time, they at least got the answer wrong at least one time, right? By conforming to the group, right? So again, this task is a staged manipulation because they're using Confederates to kind of create a kind of a real world situation. And again, they got it wrong every time. Okay. So obviously, the line that matches this line is number 2. But again, in the experiments, the Confederates would say 1 is the right answer, right? Obvious wrong answer. And the actual participant would have to make a decision whether he would go with the group or go against the group. Okay. And like I said, almost 99% of the time when they are by themselves, even with ourselves, if we're by ourselves, we're probably going to answer the answers correctly each time, right? It's just like when if you see somebody running, right, you're walking down the hallway and you see somebody running behind you, right? You may not run, right? I mean, you're just like, okay, he's running. Maybe he's late for class, right? But what if you see 6 or 7 people run by you? Then you're like, oh, shoot, something coming. If you see another 2 or 3 people run by you, then you're probably gonna run too, and you're gonna ask questions later, right? So again, the conformity has to do with again groups, right? How influential are the groups? And some of the other studies also included this one of these variables, right? How trustworthy do you feel the groups are, right? If you don't really know the people, you're probably not going to run, right? But if you see some of your friends running, you'll probably be more likely to run because you trust them, you know them really well, and so you'll probably conform more likely than not. Okay, so that's again straightforward manipulation versus stage manipulation. Again, like these are here are the results. Again, he measured the number of times each participant conformed to the majority view, and on average, 1/3 of the participants who were placed in the situation went along and conformed with clearly incorrect majority of the critical trials, right? It says over the 12 critical trials, right? I think they did 18 trials. So the first 6 trials, they were getting the answers correctly. And then after a certain point, they just stopped getting the answers correctly, right? So they mixed in right trials or when they answered it correctly versus when they didn't. All right, so it says over the 12 critical trials, about 75% of participants conformed at least one time. 75% of the time, at least once, and 25% of the participants never conformed at all. Right. So, some people are just not easily to conform. Right. And many of us in the classroom, many of us in our class. So we're going to have some that conform really, really. They're more likely to conform versus not. Right. So again, another staged example. Here's an example that I want to kind of highlight. Um, Helping hands. And so let me provide you with some context. So what you see here, and they're going to explain it, but they had a Confederate, this young lady that's lying on the street here. She was laying on the street, and what they did was the first experiment. She was walking. She looked kind of normal. She had on like business attire, right? And when she was walking, she acted like she had a medical issue, and she kind of passed out and fell to the ground, right? And within seconds, people helped her out. People helped her almost every time, right? However, when she changed her appearance, they did another trial when she changed her appearance. When she was walking, she looked kind of a little more disheveled. When she walked and she started to fall, it's like she had a health issue, and almost no one helped her after minutes and minutes of her laying on the concrete. Right. So again, for the stage part is again using a Confederate to um, to show behavior in participants. So with that experiment, there are a lot of flaws to that experiment. And you think about the way that the first lady fell, it was very abrupt. Obviously, as she was dressed in nicer clothing, but when she was redressed into, some clothing that might not been as appealing, um, it looked like she was sick, and then she was stumbling, and then she fell, right? So there was a very, very big difference in the manipulation, right? And so again, the strength of the manipulation plays a big role, right? When we talk about helping behavior, right, and helping behavior in groups of people, right, you got to be really, really careful with that actress. She acted very differently when she was dressed a little more nicely than when she was dressed in some baggier clothes and like she was there. The clothes were a little more dirty, right? So again, those we have to be really mindful of how we manipulate because that makes a big difference in the results that we get and the findings that we have at the end of the research. So, just as a general principle, we have to be able to manipulate our independent variables in order to see if those independent variables have an effect on the dependent variable, right? So just like in that experiment with the staged manipulation, when she fell really, really abruptly, she wearing a nice orange top. She fell, had her hair pinned up. Again, they were extremely willing to help within 10 seconds, right? So then when they changed the appearance of her to look something very totally different, right? When she fell, it took upwards of 30 minutes before anybody or said anything to her at all, right? So again, that is what we call a strength, right? The potential amount of impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. And the independent variable in that experiment that we just watched was the appearance of the accurate actress or the Confederate, right? This manipulation and the strength of the manipulation is really, really important, especially in the earlier stages of our research, right? So when we understand how the strength of manipulation influences the dependent variable, then we're able to then take this and then try to evaluate it in a real world setting, right? So again, we have two considerations when we begin to think about the strength of manipulation. The strongest possible manipulation may entail a situation that rarely occurs, right? So if the manipulation is too strong, right, it's not all that realistic, then we have to really be concerned about that and how it might affect the results we get. The second thing is the manipulation should be as strong as possible within the bounds of ethics, right? And so you wouldn't want to give someone who may be experiencing some kind of illness, you wouldn't want to give them too strong of a drug because then it might influence in side effects in other areas, right? So you want to be able to work within the bounds of ethics. Okay, and so we'll talk about one experiment here that has to do with the strength. But again, the way we um, produce a strength in our independent variables, again, we have to be really cognizant that they are almost as realistic so that we get information that can be generalizable to the real world and to the general population. So here is an example of an experiment. So individuals were given, so relationships between attitude similarity and liking, right? So this research was done and it details research on when we are around people who we have similar attitudes with, right? We usually like them more, right? So many of your friends, your attitudes are pretty similar, right? And so with your attitudes being pretty similar, you like them more than people who don't think like you, right? It's just like being a Democrat or a Republican. Individuals who have the same kind of political views um, tend to have friends that have similar political views, right? Individuals who have very similar taste in clothing, right? Very, very, very similar taste in parenting styles or whatever the case may be, usually tend to like each other a little bit. And so here is a linear graph where when you have a low amount of attitude similarity down here at the bottom of the independent variable, then you see a very, very low amount of liking. But as you increase the attitude similarity in the independent variable from low to high, the amount of liking goes from low to high, right? So again, when you have very high similarity in your liking, that means you're usually going to like persons that you're speaking to a lot more, right? But when we talk about the strength of manipulation, using zero, right? So using people that aren't don't really have any similarities in their attitudes, we're going to see something that's really, really extreme. And then in the upper portion up here, right? People that have attitudes that are exactly alike, very, very high in their attitude similarity, then you're going to have a very, very high liking, right? So again, we have to be mindful that those may not be realistic, right? The two extremes may not be realistic, but we might be able to see, a 5, 6, 7. Maybe that's more realistic, where the amount of attitude similarity is more moderate than it is very high or low. And then, you do have some people that have high attitude similarity, but again, for the most part, people are going to be moderately similar in their attitudes. And that's okay. I mean, that's usually what happens because we all have different perspectives. We all have different attitudes about certain things, right? So you don't like exactly everything that your friends like, but again, you do have similarities in most of the things that you all like. Okay. So again, the strength of manipulation plays a big role because if it's not realistic, then you're going to get the results that aren't can't be applied to the real world. Okay. But again, manipulation, again, that uses straightforward presentation. When we talk about presentation or manipulation, written or verbal materials are less costly than complex staged experimental manipulation. So we talk about, either straightforward manipulation versus a stage manipulation. In the experiment we saw with the actress, you would have to pay the actress. You would have to, again, the cost of just having time, right? You got to pay the individual to film if you don't have a camera. You have to rent a camera to film. So all of those things have to go into play when you're looking at staged versus straightforward presentation of stimulus. Okay. So as we talked about, there are three types of dependent variables. So we talked about independent variables and how you manipulate them, either in the control condition or the experimental condition, the variations in the independent variable. But what we want to see is there any effect of the manipulations that we have, either the staged or the straightforward, and how those manipulations affect our dependent variables. And you can either have what we call a self-report data that we receive. These are, if you're giving a survey, people are going to do a self-report, right? They're describing themselves. And again, you're giving them the survey and then they answer questions and provide you with information. You also have behavioral measures, right? So you direct observations of behaviors, right? So there's a famous study called the Bobo doll, right? And they were looking at aggression in young people. And so what they did was they had models, and this has everything to do with what we call observational learning. So they had models enter a room, and then they had the children on the opposite side of the wall, and they had a looking glass. They were able to observe an adult punching, beating up this little play doll, little inflatable doll. You punch it, you hit it with the tool, you kick it, you slap it, right? And the model then left. Then they allowed the child to go into the room with the same doll. What do you think happened? Right? They observed that model hitting and being aggressive towards the doll, and the child, likely enough, they were aggressive. They hit the doll. They did exactly what they saw the model do. And so what they were able to show was there was a rate at how aggressive they were. How many hits did they hit the Bobo doll with? Right? Reaction time is another behavioral trait. Duration is another one. Right? So again, sometimes behavioral measures, again, they sometimes are not actual measures or behaviors, but oftentimes they are. You can kind of see them explicitly, or you can ask a person, "How did you feel? And what were you going to do? What was your intention when that happened?" And then that might also give you a behavioral measure as well. Okay. One of the other dependent measures, the third one is that physiological measures. And physiological measures, again, these are recordings of responses of the body, right? So what happens when you go into a MRI, right? They're taking an image, they're looking at images of your body. When you go for a polygraph test, they look at the galvanic skin response, and they're looking at when you lie, what is your, what is your response to that? Are you beginning to sweat? How high is that sweat activity? right? They look at your blood pressure, they look at your breathing rate, they look at your heart rate. All of those things are measured by a polygraph machine. And all of these different tools and measuring tools are ways to measure responses of the body. So the electroencephalograph measures the electrical activity in the brain. So I'm looking at, okay, I present you with an image. I put these nodes on your skull, and as I show you this really mentally stimulating image, then I see the different electrical activity happening in your brain, right? Or the electromyogram that looks at electrical activity in muscles, right? So they use those a lot in sleep studies. All right. So when you're in your REM sleep, in your deepest sleep, where you're kind of basically paralyzed, you see that the electromyogram doesn't have much activity. But when you're in your earlier stages of sleep, you're moving a little bit, and so they see that over the course of the night, your muscular activity changes over the course of the time. Because again, when you are in a kind of paralyzed state in REM sleep, you have no movement whatsoever. But again, here are different instruments that are used to measure body responses. Okay. I'll play this a little bit, or I might just I'll play a little bit of it. There is a huge study on, again, those physiological measures, right? With the polygraph test, measuring heart rate and breathing rate, breathing in your chest, breathing in your stomach, also your galvanic response or your sweat response. All of those things are being measured um, as you're hooked up to those machines, right? And they're trying to see if there are any differences, right? So he had a baseline where he said, think about the beach, something really pleasant, right? And so he was at a baseline, and then they have you do something or think about something that is less pleasant, and his response uh, instantly shot up, right? So again, we're able to measure those things with those types of devices. Okay. Um, One of the biggest keys to research is being able to measure a dependent variable in multiple ways, right? And so we want to be able to have a robust method in measuring one way, but sometimes we can measure, say, for instance, we want to measure someone's motivation, right? So then we give them a survey questionnaire, and we're measuring their achievement motivation on in school, right? So then we have uh, that tool, and we have that independent variable, and they get a score on that dependent variable in motivation. So then we give them an interview. We interview them, and we're asking them questions about themselves, and then we're also able to kind of thematic analyze their words, right, to see if we can find that they're thinking and talking about motivating things, right? So we're kind of again measuring that dependent variable achievement motivation in two ways, which is really really good. It says research may also be interested in the effects of an independent variable on several different behaviors, right? So we may look at uh, motivation to achieve. We also might look at confidence. We may look at self-esteem. We also may look at self-efficacy. So we have various dependent variables that we are then manipulating with that independent variable. And again, that happens all the time. Just like with survey questionnaires, we're looking at several independent measures, or we're looking at several dependent measures, and we have maybe a few independent measures that, again, are measuring those various dependent measures. Okay. One thing that happens with our dependent variable, like it says, our dependent variable should be really sensitive or sensitive enough to detect differences between groups, right? So if I'm looking at achievement motivation, and I look at achieving motivation in students who have GPAs of 3.0 or greater, and then I look at GPAs of students that are 2.9 and below, right? With that, I'm looking at motivation. I may detect, right? The dependent variable might be sensitive enough to detect those group differences. I might see higher motivation in those who have a higher GPA versus those who have a lower GPA. And, I guess research would kind of indicate that you would see that. But what happens if your dependent variable is maybe too easy or too hard where you can't really detect any differences whatsoever, right? So if you give an independent variable that has no effect on the dependent measure, right? That means the participants quickly reach the maximum performance level, right? So what if I gave everybody in our class a math test, and it was basic arithmetic, right? Just basic math facts: 1 plus 5, 2 plus 3, 8 plus 9, right? And I gave everybody 10 questions, and that was it. Right? I'm looking at math skills. In that example, almost everybody would get a high grade, right? Because those basic math skills, almost everyone in our class would know, right? And again, maybe some would get 1 or 2 wrong, but on average, everyone would get a 100 on that test, right? 2 plus 2, 3 plus 5, right? Everyone would get, But what if I gave everyone in our class a test on differential equations, right? I have like 10 problems on differential equations. Then some of us might be able to work that out, and then others of us may not, right? We're probably going to perform very, very poorly on that test on math ability, right? So we have to find a very, very sensitive dependent variable that's going to kind of have that balance where it's not going to provide this really, really easy ceiling effect or really, really hard floor effect, right? So again, we want to be able to get our dependent variable to be sensitive enough so that we can see those results and those differences. Okay. So measuring the dependent variable. Again, some measures may be more costly than others, right? So when we are measuring, say, the MRI, if I wanted to do research on, maybe body mass or something that had to do with something structurally for someone's body, then using an MRI might be really costly to have to use a hospital to rent the hospital tech, the MRI tech. I mean, all of those things would be really, really costly. But if I wanted to just give a survey to test for achievement motivation, then that might be a little easier, right? That might be a little less costly because I can just send out a survey tool online, or print out some paper and give someone an instrument on paper, right? Again, for many types, many researchers need resources from the university or outside agencies to be able to use some of those tools. The polygraph test, right? That equipment is expensive, right? So to be able to rent, or even to be able to have a technician, be able to administer those tests, I'd have to pay somebody to do that, which could be really, really, really costly. Okay. So then we talk about controlling for expectations. We're going to talk about both expectations for participants, and we're also talking about expectations for researchers. But the first expectations that we have to control for are participant expectations. And we've talked about deception. We talked about deception, I think, in chapter 1 or 2. And so we were talking about deception. If participants in our study are familiar about what is going to be covered on with the study, then their behaviors and their responses to certain questions may be affected by it. And so it's important that we mitigate the effect of their expectations by using maybe some slight deception, so that they don't really know. They can't really confirm what's going on with the study, right? So when participants form expectations about the hypothesis, they do what is necessary to confirm the hypothesis. And so we don't want that to happen. We want them to act naturally. And so by maybe staging a manipulation in a way that gives a little deception, then we're actually able to see how people would actually behave in a natural setting. Right? Again, deception is an opportunity to mitigate this effect. There are 2 things that we can do. The demand characteristics, right, are, again, when we understand the characteristics of the experiment, again, sometimes the participants know, if they know the purpose of the study, then they're going to, again, confirm the hypothesis. So in order to kind of mask that, we have to give them a little deception. We have to tell them that they're doing one study on vision when they're actually doing we're measuring them on reaction time, right? So again, being able to deceive slightly helps with those demand characteristics. When we're talking about research evaluations or questionnaires, you want to fill different items in there to kind of throw off, because we're all analyzing things that we read, right? And so if I read several questions and they're all related to uh, mental health, right, then I'm likely going to think, oh, okay, this is a questionnaire about mental health and my mental health, right? So I would then want to put in some unrelated items on the questionnaire to kind of disguise what I'm looking to ask, right? So I'll put in some questions about school. I'll put in some questions about their favorite time on the beach or what they're going to be doing for spring break. All of those things could be filler questions to help disguise the dependent variable that we're actually trying to study. Okay. One other thing that we can do is the placebo effect. We talked about that, right? Giving someone a placebo gives them the idea that, okay, I'm actually receiving a drug when I'm actually not, right? So the control group might get the placebo effect, or you might have a control group, then you have a placebo group, and then you have the actual group that's getting the experimental drug, right? Because if you think about it, researchers have shown that the placebo effect is totally a thing, right? So just administering apparent treatment may be sufficient to cause an observed improvement in the behavior, right? So that's when you have to be really, really cognizant of how the placebo effect plays a role in your dependent variable. But to control for this, researchers use what we call a placebo group. So participants in a drug study who receive an inert substance instead of the experimental drug, right? Or you just do a complete control group where the placebo group, and then you have a control group, and then you have the actual group that's getting the experimental drug, right? So then you're able to see if the placebo group is having any effect on the behavior versus the experimental group and the control group. So if there are any differences, you'll be able to identify those. And again, like we were talking about when we talk about ethical implications, when I give a group maybe some experimental drug to affect some kind of illness or to improve on some illness, then if I give a placebo group a placebo and I give the experimental drug to the research group or experimental group, and I see some improvement uh, in their in their way of life, then I also want to, after the study, I also want to give that same drug to the placebo control group so that everyone has an opportunity to receive the benefits of that drug. Okay. All right. So one thing that happens for researchers is what we call expectancy effects, right? So when I have an expectancy effect, essentially I'm biasing myself as a researcher, right? So I have this study that I'm doing. I'm a researcher on campus, and this is my life's work. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I want my research to have an impact um, on the academic world, right? So as we have these really ambitious experimenter or a really ambitious researcher, the experimenter might unintentionally treat participants differently in various conditions of the study in order to get the results that they want. And again, it's unintentional. Oftentimes, it's just an unconscious way that we treat different people in order to get the things that we want to see happen, right? And so when that happens, we'll see those subtle differences in how the researcher interprets and records the information that they're provided, right? So again, it's not that they're trying to be really deceptive. It's not that they're trying to be dishonest. Oftentimes, it's a kind of a bias that we have and an unconscious just behaviors, right? So if I'm interviewing a person and I'm interviewing them on a particular topic, and they say something that I really, really agree with, and I know that it'll help my study, then I might give them a nod and give them a smile, and then they continue to answer in that way in order to give me the results I need. Or if someone I'm interviewing, they say something that I don't really agree with, and I frown a little bit, and I kind of shake my head, then I might get them to kind of change how they're responding to some of the interview questions because of the way I respond. And so that again kind of affirms kind of that expectancy effects. There are two specific ways to minimize the expectancy effect. The one thing that we do is the participant is unaware of whether placebo or the actual drug is being administered, right? However, the experimenter still has some expectancy effect, right? And they can still kind of bias and influence the participants. The most the gold standard, the surefire way to remove or try to reduce the expectancy effects for the both participant and the researcher is a double-blind experiment where neither the participant nor the experimenter knows whether the placebo or the actual treatment is being given. And so they don't know who's in what group, and they can't treat anybody with any specific way because they don't know who's in the control group or who's in the actual, right? So again, the double blind treatment, you have maybe another researcher that's helping you, and they are kind of neutral in their and how they're going to help you with the project, and they're helping you with this double blind experiment. They know who's in the placebo group and the actual experiment group that you have no clue. Okay. One final consideration as we start to plan our research project is we want to be able to pilot, right? We want to be able to pilot our studies. One way to do this is to get a small group of participants and just run a small trial to see if I'm getting the results that I want to see, right? For research, survey research, this is really, really important, right? For surveys, right? If I have a survey that I want to administer to a group, then I want to administer that survey before to a small group before I send it to the larger group. Because what if I have errors, or what if the skip logic is not working the way I want, or what if I have some double barrel questions and I run into some of those issues that we learned about in last class, right? In chapter 8, right? We want to be able to, or was it chapter 7 rather, asking people about themselves. We want to be able to fix those things if we see any issue with the pilot study. Okay. One thing we also want to determine is what, the manipulation check, right? So when we're doing this trial run with an experiment, I want to directly measure whether the independent variable has any attendant effect on the participants that I want to see, right? And so I want to see, okay, if I manipulate this drug and give this dosage to one group and give this other dosage to the other group, am I seeing a difference or a significant difference that I want to see or not, right? And I might change the amount of dosages that I get as far as the experimental drug that I give to the treatment group, okay? And then the last thing I want to do is I just want to do a debrief. I want to debrief. It provides me with the opportunity to interact with the participants after the data has been collected to see, okay, how did you feel about those questions that I asked in the survey? Or how did you feel about the drug that you took, right? Or the activity that we did in the lab, right? How did you feel about that? What should I change? What should I add? What should I modify to make the experiment and the research that much more robust and more valuable? Okay. One of the last things that you do once you get your results, you have to again administer results. Administer the survey, or you do your experiments, and then what you have to do after that, you have to collect your data. Once your data is all collected, you have to clean your data once you clean it, and then you analyze it, right? So the statistical analysis of data that's carried out allow the researcher to kind of examine and interpret the pattern of your results, right? So I gave a group of students, again, I love to use the math intervention. I gave a group of students a math intervention after. So I gave them pre-test, I gave them the math intervention for 3 weeks, and then I gave them post-test, right? So this math test is the dependent variable. I'm looking at how they scored on this math test to see if there's any significant difference in the before and the after they are engaged in the intervention, right? But again, I want to see if there's a relationship between my independent variable, my control group, and my my experimental group, or just the two times that they took the test for the repeated measures. I want to see if there's any major difference that occurred through the independent variable, which would be the intervention, and the dependent variable would be the scores of the test. Okay. The last thing is you have to be able to communicate your research to others, right? And so what we've done over the course of the last several weeks, you've been looking at literature reviews for your own research proposal. You have looked at research that was submitted for your collaborative research presentation. But again, all of those research articles that you found, those are individuals who submitted their article through to a professional association and or to a journal, and they had it peer reviewed. Right. That's why I asked for peer review papers, because those peer review papers, those papers are reviewed by expert panel, and then they are then produced. Right. This is the quality research that you're reading, and I want you to be able to see. Again, this is how it's done. It goes through a peer review process, and then it's published in an actual journal, either an online journal or a physical copy. Okay. Usually, we present at meetings, right? So I have a meeting, a research conference to go to in Atlanta, the Society for Community Research and Action. And so we present research findings there. We have what we call professional association meetings, where we give research and we listen to research from different people, right? We're able to collaborate on certain things while we're there, right? When we're talking about research as far as peer review, it says as many as 90% of the papers submitted to more prestigious journals are rejected, right? So they're looking for the quality of research, right? So only 10% usually get accepted into those high and more prestigious journals, right? So that's, when you get those journal articles, just be mindful of, who the reviewers are, what quality of research they're wanting to accept, and usually you're going to get that high quality gold standard research. And so again, you go through all this to eventually be able to communicate your research, your findings to the general public and to other researchers who may be interested in replicating your study. All right, so that's all I have for today. That is chapter 9. I want to thank y'all again for the good first half of the semester. You all are doing really well. Keep up the amazing work. Again, you do have a quiz on Sunday, so be mindful of that. It'll cover all of chapter 9. You all have been doing a great job of getting the quizzes done. But just make sure that you are again familiar with all these research questions, because as we begin to prepare for our next test or next exam, again, these review questions are going to be really, really important for those who are going to wanting to study now. Right? If you can answer these questions on the review questions at the end of the slides, then that gives you a greater chance of doing extremely well on the exam. Okay, many of you are doing well already, but again, knowing those review questions is going to be really important as you move forward. Again, thank you so much for watching the video. Happy spring break to everyone. You all be safe. Please return safely. Protect yourself. If you're traveling, please be careful on the roads. Be situationally aware. Make sure that you're looking around and at your surroundings. Take care of yourself physically, mentally, emotionally. Make sure you come back safe. You all mean a lot to me as a class, and so I want you all to be safe. I want you all to be successful, and just enjoy yourself, rest, and let's get back on the following week, ready to achieve and ready to do the best we can and perform at our best and highest level. All right. Well, I'll see you all later, and we'll see you all. I'll forget the 17, 18, 19 on the 20th of March. Talk to you all later.